You go to New Mexico expecting vast skies, the smell of pinyon smoke, and a landscape that seems to remember every footstep ever taken across it. You expect mesas flattened by time, pueblos clustered like slow-breathing organisms, and roads that, worn into the earth, point politely toward the next obvious destination. What you do not expect, unless someone has taken you by the arm and whispered it in your ear, is that beneath that courteous surface there are places where the ordinary rules of explanation begin to fray. You do not expect to find stonework that aligns with constellations in ways that strain the imagination, or a white gypsum playa that preserves footprints laid down by hands that could not possibly have belonged to people we thought we knew, or scattered burial mounds that hint at cultural connections stretching far beyond any map drawn in our textbooks. And yet there they are, stubborn, layered, unresolved. The first time you stand at the lip of a canyon or on the hard-packed rim of a dry lakebed and feel the air seem to thicken, you might laugh at your own romanticism, until something very specific, a line of cut stone or a fossilized ripple in the dust, insists otherwise. Then the shiver is not about ghosts but about the small, unnerving remainder that even the most thorough scientific sweep cannot yet account for. This script is an invitation, no, a summons, to walk those edges with eyes that are both skeptical and ready to be astonished. We will not peddle certainties. That would do a disservice to the places themselves. Instead, we will gather the evidence we have, artifacts with strange compositions, alignments that persist through centuries, oral fragments from descendants whose own memories are incomplete, and place them side by side with the theories that attempt to make sense of them. At times you will hear the clear, measured voice of archaeology, cataloging sherds and radiocarbon dates. At other moments you will hear the rougher, human debris, stories told at kitchen tables, the half-remembered verses of a teacher's lesson, the kind of local superstition that historians are increasingly cautious about discarding. The point is to let the complexity remain. To sit with the fact that sometimes a hammer and trowel meet a riddle they cannot crack, and the riddle stares back, patient and indifferent. We promise surprises here, not the cheap revelations of cable drama, but the slow, accumulating astonishments that come from careful looking. If you are the sort of person who wants tidy endings, be prepared to leave with questions. If you are the sort of person who finds comfort in the unresolved, welcome home. I will ask you to imagine, repeatedly. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, your breath a soft cloud in the chill, your flashlight catching the glint of a stone that refuses to match the rest. Picture yourself on the flats at dusk, when the world seems to tilt toward silence and the horizon becomes a flat, undecorated story. Imagine that the past is not merely behind glass but folded into the present like layers in a canyon wall, each stratum a voice. We will move from the measurable to the mythic, always returning to the evidence. We will talk about trade routes that cross deserts and mountains, about bones found under unusual conditions, about pottery with motifs that betray a hand from elsewhere. We will also talk about the giants who appear in some of the later myths, the lost tribes whispered about in the edges of settler narratives, the ancient voyagers some people insist must have crossed oceans. Now, let's be fair, many of these ideas are speculative, some fly off the leash of probability. Still, for all the evidence we possess, something stubbornly unaccounted for remains. And that unaccounted for is where wonder breathes. Our path will weave through 6 deep mysteries, places where science has done excellent work and yet has stopped short of a final answer, and we will end with a reflection on why these open questions matter. Because the real point is not that mysteries exist, the point is that they change how we imagine ourselves in a landscape. They ask us to reconsider what we mean by settlement, by culture, by contact. They remind us that human life is messy, migratory, and often deliberately inscrutable. They press us to remember that, sometimes, a stone speaks because someone wanted it to speak. Keep your curiosity sharp. Keep your skepticism ready. And let the places do what they do best, unsettle, teach, and if you listen closely enough, demand a story. The first place to meet this paradox is a bowl-shaped valley of stone and silence, where the evidence is at once blunt and unnervingly specific. Ancient roads and great houses that align with the horizon as if designed to hold the sun itself in some public, ceremonial way. You can say the name, Chaco Canyon, and historians will nod yes, between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, this was the locus of a remarkable fluorescence of ancestral Puebloan culture. You can list the dry facts: great houses with rooms numbering into the hundreds and kivas, subterranean circular ceremonial chambers, whose designs speak of shared ritual. You can cite the dates from dendrochronology, beams cut from trees felled in clearly identifiable years, precise to the season in many cases, giving us unparalleled timestamps for construction episodes. You can point to pottery styles that show long-distance trade, shells from the Pacific, turquoise, and copper bells echoing Mesoamerican forms, and conclude that Chaco was an axis in a network that stretched south and west. And yet here's where it gets tricky. The site's architecture is so monumental, so formally regular, and so astronomically attentive that some archaeologists have called Chaco a pre-industrial city, in the best sense of the word, while others insist it was something else entirely: a ceremonial center, a pilgrimage nexus, an imperial capital in a landscape of dispersed farming communities. Which is it? The evidence seems to let both readings breathe. Walk slowly through the Great North Road, yes, the one that subjects its course to the sky, striding straight as an arrow for miles over rough terrain, and think about the sheer will embedded in such a construction. Measurements help: miles of meticulously leveled surface, terraces carved by hands that understood the land. But now add the astronomical alignments, kivas and room blocks oriented to solar and lunar standstills, and the scale begins to suggest not merely utility but cosmology. The Chaco builders set their structures in conversation with the heavens. We still don't know precisely why the alignment is so persistent. Was it calendrical, a public way of tracking ceremonial cycles for a dispersed population? Was it part of a priestly elite's power play, staking temporal authority on the heavens? Did it serve both? Multiple competing theories have weight. Some suggest Chaco was a hub for ritualized exchange. People came at designated times to observe sacred cycles, share goods, and participate in large-scale ceremonials. Others propose that it functioned as an administrative center for a polity that exacted labor and tribute from smaller outlying communities whose fields and homes we still search for. Archaeobotanical evidence complicates both stories. While corn agriculture was central, isotopic analysis of human remains indicates a diet more varied and mobile than a simple city-state model allows. We still don't know how deep the coercion, if any, ran. We still don't know whether the roads were primarily processional or practical. The mythic element presses in because Chaco's scale, its great kivas and massive masonry, is so unusual for the high desert. Folk stories gathered by ethnographers in later centuries echo the site's otherness. Tales of giants who moved rocks with a single tug, of stars that came down to touch the plaza in certain seasons, and of sacred bundles carried across long distances by peoples who would not leave them unattended. These are, on the face of it, symbolic or later extrapolation, but oral tradition matters because it carries kernels of social memory. Picture yourself walking that road at dawn, fog clinging to the low mesas, light sharpening the edges of sandstone. Imagine the hush of a crowd gathered not for trade but for a ritual that mapped their lives onto the movements of celestial bodies. Imagine the hush broken by drumming echoing through a kiva, a sound that reverberates in the bone like a remembered rhythm. Now imagine, as some have, that these gatherings were not merely local but attracted people from far-flung plateaus, drawn by the promise of exotic goods and collective timekeeping. The archaeological record supports both a local scale and a cosmopolitan reach. The tension is not a failure of evidence but a reminder that human societies are rarely one thing or another. Layered in the dirt are the specific, maddening clues, precisely cut masonry that in some lines seems to change style in ways that defy a simple chronological progression, turquoise beads strung in contexts that suggest ceremonial deposition rather than personal ornamentation, isotopic signals and teeth that point to childhoods spent across surprisingly different ecologies. Trade routes are visible in the shards. Designs that borrow from Mesoamerica find echoes here, yet local traditions persist in stubborn, distinctive twists. One scholar famously compared Chaco's architecture to a stage set built for a performance, whose rules we no longer know. Still, for all the evidence we possess, the dates, the trade goods, the preserved beams that give us a timeline, some large question refuses to be framed cleanly. Why did Chaco's fluorescence end? The decline around the 12th century is sudden in some respects. Abandonment is not instant, but within a few generations the great houses are emptying. Drought proxies tell us one important part of the story. Tree ring sequences showing prolonged dry intervals. Lake sediments speaking of aridity. But environmental stress rarely acts alone. Social reorganization, changing trade networks, or ideological shifts may have played equal roles. We still don't know the relative weight of these drivers. As with Chaco, the second mystery is a place where a single discovery rewrites assumptions. On a broad, blindingly white expanse of gypsum, you can walk for miles without the distraction of shade or the opacity of vegetation. The White Sands area, with its dunes and playas, seems at first glance to be a place for ghosts, wind-blown silence, and a sky so large it makes personal problems feel petty. But in recent years a find settled into the sediment here that has forced scholars to reconsider timelines, the remains of human footprints pressed into ancient, now buried surfaces, dated by radiocarbon analysis of pollen and organic layers to times well before previously accepted arrival dates for certain cultural markers. When you see a track, you see evidence of a person who was there. No reinterpretation will erase that immediacy. The dates matter. They push the timeline for human activity in North America into richer, more complex territory. A footprint does not explain cultural practices, but it does tighten the envelope of possibility. Was this an isolated band of hunter-gatherers? Part of a broader, misunderstood migration pattern? Or evidence that coastal or transcontinental contacts occurred earlier than our models allow? Multiple theories are lively and sometimes heated. Some argue that the footprints are unequivocal proof of early human presence in the region. Others suggest contamination or reworking of sediments could bias dates. Still, for all the caution, a human footprint is emphatic, an index fossil of humanity. We still don't know the full story behind those prints. There are other kinds of mysteries in New Mexico that are quieter but no less confounding. Take, for example, smaller, dispersed sites where the material culture seems to come from contradictory horizons, pottery forms that suggest one ceramic tradition, lithic techniques that speak of another, and burial practices that defy easy classification. When radiocarbon dates from these sites scatter across unexpected centuries, a mosaic emerges that is hard to place on any single timeline. One such cluster on the high plains shows evidence of finely made points, and an unusually high proportion of marine shell in burial contexts. How did these items arrive so far inland? How cemented were the social or ritual ties that brought them? Trade routes, again, are a comfortable explanation, but they must now account for surprises, obsidian sources traced through geochemical fingerprinting to regions hundreds of kilometers away, and textile impressions that suggest weaving traditions not previously linked to the area. Now, let's be fair. Trade networks can be extensive, and humans have always been mobile. Still, for all the evidence, the presence of these exotic goods in contexts that do not conform to our neat cultural boxes commands a pause. And then there are bones. Not just bones, but bones found in unusual arrangements, accompanied by odd objects, a seemingly juvenile skeleton buried with an adult-sized ceremonial mace, or remains found in positions that suggest deliberate, ritualized contortion. Osteological analysis tells us about age, diet, and stress markers, but it does not always tell us about the intentions behind a burial. Some of these interments were apparently meant to be dramatic, public displays of social statements, perhaps the deposition of a person meant to be remembered. Others whisper of disease, violence, or even climatic catastrophe. The mythic overlay is inevitable: lost tribes, cursed stones, giants whose bones become the scaffolding of later oral history. Those myths are not scientific evidence, but they are part of the cultural sediment. Picture yourself standing at such a burial site, the wind lifting dust in soft spirals, an old stone marker half buried and impossibly plain, like a punctuation mark someone left centuries ago. You imagine the hands that arrange the bones, the rituals, drums echoing through the night, and you feel, with a small, worrying clarity, that some piece of the ceremonial grammar has been lost. We still don't know why certain burial rites appear, disappear, or re-emerge in surprising places. And then, in quieter corners of the state, there are artifacts that don't want to be categorized. Stone discs with pecked grooves that align not with settled architecture but with the migration paths of animals, carved petroglyphs that seem to show improbable creatures or boats, and singular, worked stones that bear tool marks inconsistent with known local lithic traditions. Some of these items suggest contact, perhaps indirect, with faraway cultures. Others suggest local innovations that our frameworks have been too rigid to accommodate. Imagine a small community sitting at the edge of an arroyo, trading with caravan-like itinerants who bring beads from the distant coast, and with them, stories. Imagine that one of those stories concerns a misplaced stone that later becomes a talisman, copied into petroglyphs that archaeologists find centuries later and interpret as either ritual or merely decorative. Now imagine that a new chemical analysis shows the stone's mineralogy comes from a source not known to be exploited until centuries later. The arithmetic of things like this is maddening. Each new analysis is a small door, and behind it can be a whole, unanticipated room. Through all of this, there is a steady drumbeat, evidence, hypothesis, and then the stubborn presence of the unknown. We will move from Chaco's planned avenues to the whispering dunes of white sands, from puzzling burial rites to objects that refuse clear provenance, always keeping the balance between what can be demonstrated and what remains speculative. Along the way we will meet people, archaeologists who guard their data like sacred text, local elders whose memories thread through generational gaps, and skeptics who insist on the primacy of testable, replicable findings. We will listen to each voice and let it shape our sense of the places we try to imagine. For now, stand with me on a ridge and look back at the road we came in on. The landscape is quiet, but not mute. It hums with the possible meanings people have laid down over centuries. We still don't know many things. That is its invitation. You stand at the edge of a plaza and feel, for a moment, as if you have stepped into a place that was intended to pause time. The stones have that stubborn patience, the masonry like a sentence carved slowly and deliberately, each block a word chosen for its weight. Walk among the great houses and the sense of scale overwhelms the imagination, rooms nested within rooms, thick walls that keep heat in winter and cool in summer, doorways whose low lintels force you to bow as if in the presence of authority. Scholars measure those rooms and the beams that once spanned them, and from the rings of cut timbers they tell a remarkable story of planning and pauses, a construction boom, pauses that align with climatic signals, bursts of addition that suggest organized labor. We can, with exquisite confidence, point to the years when beams were felled. We can say, for example, that a set of square-cut timbers in one of the major room blocks dates unmistakably to the year 1027 C. We can say with similar clarity that different expansions took place over a span of centuries. And yet, the cool clarity of those dates collides with a different kind of evidence, the way the whole complex seems to be designed more for spectacle than for mere shelter. Imagine plazas aligned so that an observer at a particular doorway would watch the noon sun strike a specific stone on the equinox. Imagine houses built with such consistency of direction that the town itself becomes a kind of instrument, a public mechanism for measuring the heavens. There are technical arguments about why such alignments matter. Some archaeologists argue that the orientations served as public calendars, necessary for regulating agricultural cycles across a society whose agricultural success depended on timing planting and harvesting to a precarious rainfall pattern. Others counter that the labor required to build such elaborate communal architecture on a repeated schedule suggests a social impetus beyond practical necessity, collective ceremonies, the periodic congregation of dispersed households, the staging of political theater. Add to this the extraordinary logistics embedded in the site. Food and fuel do not magically appear, they require transport. The presence of non-local materials, marine shell ornaments, copper bells, macaw feathers whose pigments betray a Mesoamerican origin, forces any practical dry assessment to admit that goods and ideas flowed in surprising volume. Why did people undertake such journeys? Pilgrimage for goods? Political obligation? Marriage alliances that spanned hundreds of kilometers? The material record gestures at all of these possibilities without committing to one. Now, let's be fair, archaeology is a science of inference. A shard can speak, but it cannot answer every question about the intentions behind its maker's hands. Still, some anomalies demand attention. Consider the monumental roads that radiate from the canyon, straight and unyielding, crossing gullies and climbing ridges in ways that suggest design rather than mere worn paths. The Great North Road, for one, runs outward and then dissolves into the landscape, its directionality unwavering even when a detour would have been far easier. Why carve such a road if not to send a message about unity, power, or a shared cosmology? One theory proposes that such axes were communal processional ways, a choreography of movement that reified belonging and hierarchy. Another posits that they were infrastructural lines for moving bulk goods, timber, corn, salt, on a scale that indicates centralized coordination. Both theories carry weight, and perhaps the most likely truth sits somewhere between them, multifunctional constructs that married symbolism and utility. If you listen closely to the rock, you will hear the other kinds of evidence, the small, human gestures preserved by accident. A storage room with a concentration of charred corn kernels tells of diet and storeroom protocols. Hearths layered with ash and small animal bones whisper of daily meals and ritual offerings. A single rare bead carefully placed beneath a floor suggests a deposit of meaning, an offering left to anchor a building. These intimate touches contrast with the grand architectural flourishes and compel a recognition that Chacoan life was both public spectacle and private ritual. The people who built and used these rooms were not monolithic actors but families, artisans, ritual specialists, laborers. In their combined activity, they created a place that both accommodated and amplified human contradiction. Then, inevitably, the question of collapse enters the conversation like an unwelcome but necessary guest. Tree-ring sequences point to a series of drought years in the late 1100s, multi-year dry intervals that would have stressed rain-fed maize agriculture. Yet drought alone seldom explains the dissolution of complex social arrangements. What about internal conflict? Shifts in ideology? The fracturing of trade networks? The movement of elites? Some propose that as distant exchange networks faltered, the incentives to gather at a central place diminished, leading to a slow hollowing out. Others argue for social schisms that made the maintenance of large, ceremonial projects politically impossible. Still another view suggests that the abandonment of big houses reflects not collapse but reorganization. People chose to live differently, dispersing into smaller units better adapted to environmental change. The bones of children found in some peripheral sites show stress markers consistent with nutritional stress, which complicates the romantic image of Chaco as a gleaning center untouched by hardship. We cannot ignore the human toll that environmental fluctuations exacted. Myths fill some of the gaps the science cannot. Local stories collected in the centuries after Chaco's abandonment speak in language both reverent and ominous, accounts of star people who taught geometry to stonecutters, of stones that sang when the moon was full, and of invisible hands that rearranged cairns overnight. These are not empirical data, but they are culturally meaningful. They are the ways descendants framed an absence as a presence, turning empty plazas into sites of memory. Picture yourself in that same plaza at dusk, the air cooled and thin, the horizon a flat rim polished by light. Imagine the hush of a crowd, thousands of people, if the scale of the architecture is any guide, suddenly broken by a chant, the low-frequency resonance of drums that rolls like a weather front. Imagine someone leading a procession along the Great North Road, turquoise glinting on their garments, the procession meant to reconcile the people with the sky. The scene feels plausible because the built environment insists on it, yet the fact that we must imagine it underscores how much of human experience remains unrecorded in material remains. So what do we take away when the stone cools and the sun sets behind the mesa? First, that Chaco Canyon was not merely a local phenomenon but a hub where diverse currents intersected, trade, ritual, politics, and astronomy braided into a single place. Second, that its architecture, with alignments and scale, raises questions about social organization that are not yet resolved. Third, that the narratives we tell, archaeological, oral, speculative, each claim a portion of the truth without encompassing it fully. We still don't know whether Chaco should be read first as city, ceremonial capital, or cosmological stage. We still don't know how much coercion underwrote its labor, and we still don't know the exact mixture of environmental and social pressures that led to its decline. Those unknowns are not failures of scholarship but the honest shadows cast by truly ancient complexity. We stand, then, not as judges pronouncing a final verdict, but as witnesses willing to hold contradictory evidence in our hands. From the stone silence of Chaco we move eastward in imagination to a landscape equally stark and deceptively soft, the gypsum flats and dunes of white sands, where light is an active participant, and where the ground itself has only recently been forced to reveal one of the most intimate traces of an ancient steppe: human footprints. Not on pottery or in bone but in the earth like punctuation marks in a sentence no longer spoken. In the layered sediments of an ancient lakebed, paleoclimatologists and archaeologists found tracks preserved by the interplay of wet mud and rapid burial by wind-blown gypsum. When dated, those impressions suggested human presence earlier than many models had comfortably allowed, challenging linear narratives about the timing and pathways of human settlement in North America. Imagine bending down at the lip of such a print, the little ridges preserved like fingerprints, and feeling an almost physical contact with a person whose name is forever unknown. The immediacy of a footprint, its length, the stride between two prints, the depth that hints at weight, carries an intimacy that most artifacts lack. The dating of those prints matters because they whisper at the edges of larger debates. Traditional models of peopling hypothesized migration routes and timing based on assumed corridors and technological markers. But direct evidence of human presence in unexpected places at unexpected times forces revisions. Some scholars argue that such prints indicate ephemeral forays into the region by hunter-gatherer bands whose range was far broader than previously modeled. Others propose that these are markers of a longer-term occupation previously invisible in the archaeological record because of preservation biases, sites lost to erosion or covered by dunes. A third, more controversial set of voices suggests that these prints could be evidence of multiple, asynchronous migrations, a patchwork of peoples arriving in different modes and at different times rather than a single expansion. The sedimentary context is complex. Reworking, bioturbation, and post-depositional processes can complicate chronology. Some critics demand conservatism because the implications are so large. Still, the simple fact remains: a human foot impressed into a surface is an index of presence that cannot be wished away. We should, of course, couple wonder with caution. Dating sediments requires careful stratigraphic work and multiple lines of evidence: radiocarbon on associated organic material, optically stimulated luminescence on mineral grains, and cross-references with regional climate proxies. In some cases, the dates crowd against assumptions in ways that send scholars back to the field rather than forward with certainty. This is healthy. Science is a conversation with evidence, and when new evidence intrudes, the conversation must adapt. Consider the image of a small group of people walking at dawn across a playa, their silhouettes elongated by an acute sun, carrying the day's catch and a child in a simple cradleboard. They leave tracks, which become buried by a swift storm. Untold centuries later, we uncover those tracks and must, from their spacing and depth, reconstruct the gait, the possible load carried, and even whether the party paused to hunt or merely passed. That reconstruction is not guesswork, it is reasoned inference built on measurable proxies. But the inferences, however careful, do not deliver the narrative certainty people crave. We still don't know whether those prints represent transient passage or sustained habitation, whether the people who made them were ancestors of later resident populations or members of lineages that disappeared into the deep past. You step away from the canyon stone grammar and carry its weight into a different register of New Mexico's past, where rooms are not stacked into civic spectacle but tucked into cliff faces and carved into sandstone like secrets pressed into the rock. Imagine the Gila cliff dwellings, narrow entrances giving onto shadowed rooms, hand-smooth plaster walls, and the sense that people chose to live half-hidden, sheltered by overhangs and the weathering patterns of an older world. The Mogollon people who built there, whose activity archaeologists tie to roughly the late 12th and 13th centuries C, left behind pottery styles and woven artifacts that point to a culture sophisticated in craft and intimate with its landscape. Precision in dating comes from a mix of tree-ring analysis and stratified deposits, beams and charred timbers that place construction within a few decades, habitation layers that reveal diet and seasonality. Yet even with these data, gaps yawn wide. How and why did these communities regroup under cliffs rather than on open mesas? Was it defense, ritual preference, a response to climate change, or something subtler, a cultural reorientation toward verticality and concealment that expressed the changing cosmology? Archaeologists have catalogued the beads and potsherds, the macaw's feather pigments traded in from far south, and the trade routes that crosscut ecological zones like threads in a broad tapestry. One interpretation reads the cliff dwellings as a practical adaptation to stress, a material record of people making safer homes during a time of increasing competition for resources. Another reads them as chosen architectural expressions, plazas moved into caves, solar exposures carefully measured, rooms arranged for privacy and communal ritual in equal measure. Both perspectives command respect because both can be supported by data. Hearth concentrations reveal daily life. Ceremonial deposits hint at the sacred. And then there are the stories passed down that slip between the archaeological lines. Tales of people who retreated into rock to learn new arts from the stone itself. Stories of guardians who refused to leave and whose footprints were later mistaken for the marks of giants. Picture yourself crouching at a cliff mouth, the air cool, the light shifting like a stage cue, listening for voices that the rock might remember. You feel as if time has been palimpsest, each generation riding over the last. Move then to the town of Aztec, not the distant empire but a place in northwestern New Mexico where the ruins present another variant of Puebloan complexity. The Aztec Ruins National Monument, its great kivas and multi-story room blocks, shares DNA with Chacoan planning, yet it also bears local signatures. Excavations reveal beams dated to the 11th and 12th centuries CE, masonry techniques that echo Chaco, and yet variations in potting and household layout that suggest local adaptation or a distinct social project. The site's scale and the presence of ritual space complicate any single-story narrative. Was Aztec an independent center in dialogue with Chaco, a provincial offshoot, or a deliberate imitation adopted by emulators seeking prestige? The artifacts make the case that exchange was robust: turquoise, shell, and a ceramic vocabulary that links regions. The debates among scholars are technical and sometimes heated. Are we looking at a colonial imprint, a ceremonial appropriation, or an autonomous community that selectively borrowed features? Theories proliferate because the evidence is generous but not decisive. Overlay these material facts with myths, and you get a different kind of map. Local tales speak of people who could read the night and bring it into their houses, of hereditary ritualists who controlled the rhythm of planting and feasting, and of distant voyagers who left turquoise as a promise of return. These myths, like the masonry, are structural. They scaffold memory and provide a narrative architecture through which the living remember the dead. Imagine standing in an Aztec great kiva during a storm, the sound of rain hammered into the roof beams, and you sense the choreography of ceremony, bodies moving in a darkened space, voices low, the smell of pinyon smoke thick and steady. The archaeological record gives us measurements, room counts, kiva diameters, radiocarbon ranges, but it does not give us the choreography. We still do not know precisely how ceremonies unfolded, who led them, and how power was distributed in ways that left no single, unambiguous trace. If you like your mysteries written in stone and ink, then El Morro is a place that insists on being read and reread. The low butte there, its sheltered basin and water-holding pool, served as a waypoint for centuries and attracted a palimpsest of markings, from petroglyphs scratched by ancestral hands to Spanish inscriptions carved by conquistadors and travelers in the 16th and 17th centuries. The layering is literal. You can read dates etched by different hands, Spanish signatures from the 1600s abutting geometric forms whose lineage may extend into pre-contact times. The site yields an uncomfortable, tantalizing juxtaposition. It is both a utilitarian waterstop and a cultural ledger, the rock and archive that cannot be easily ordered. Scholars study the petroglyphs and inscriptions for what they reveal about continuity and change. Some glyphs resist categorization, showing figures and motifs that do not fit comfortably into known iconographic families. Were they local symbols overloaded with meaning, sigils for clan identity, or records of events now opaque to us? The presence of travel notes etched in different languages over time suggests continuity of memory, the same rock acting as a focal point for meaning over centuries. Picture yourself approaching El Morro on a hot afternoon, water glittering below, the air heavy with heat. Running your fingers over the carved lines, you feel a directness that bridges centuries. Elsewhere, the landscape offers enigmas in the form of isolated artifacts that defy easy categorization. Consider the occasional discovery of worked stones whose petrography does not match any known local source. Geochemical fingerprinting, an advanced technique that analyzes trace elements to tie materials to specific quarries, has identified obsidian and lithic flakes traceable to quarries hundreds of kilometers away. A bead of shell, chemically linked to the Gulf, whispers of trade overland or by coastal passage. One community's discarded tool thus becomes an index of mobility and exchange, upsetting assumptions about how bounded or porous prehistoric societies were. The presence of non-local goods in otherwise ordinary domestic contexts complicates simple models of regional isolation. Were these items carried by merchants, diplomats, families in migration, or by itinerant specialists who moved seasonally? Each possibility has a different implication for social organization, trade networks that are transactional versus networks imbued with kinship and ritual ties. Bones complicate the narrative further because they carry the signature of lived experience, diet, disease, mobility. Skeletal remains analyzed for isotopic content reveal childhood diets indicating geographic breadth, milk and corn in some ratios, wild game signals in others, that map onto patterns of mobility. Trauma on bones hints at conflict but also at labor stresses, the grinding economy of daily life. Sometimes the burials themselves add mystery, a burial facing a direction anomalous for the region, a pattern of interments with grave goods inconsistent with neighbors. Archaeologists debate whether these signs indicate new ethnic groups arriving, internal social changes, or ritual choices that defy our categories. Imagine kneeling at the earth where such a person was laid to rest, the wind lifting the dust as if to tattle on the past. You stand at the interface of the intimate and the unknowable. There are even more unsettling claims that surface at the margins of respectable archaeology, stories that the mainstream has to address because the evidence, or the lack of it, invites speculation. These include tales of giant skeletons uncovered in the early decades of settler expansion, often reported without verifiable records and later impossible to locate. Skepticism is warranted. Many such stories derive from 19th-century newspapers that favored sensational copy, or from misread indigenous oral histories. Good scholarship insists on documentary chains and reproducible data. The absence of those chains means giants remain legend rather than paleontological fact. Yet myths of giants persist and are meaningful in their own right. They are part of the cultural landscape, articulating fears and fascinations about difference, size, and the past's perceived strangeness. They also shape how newcomers interpret archaeological remains, sometimes shading interpretations with a desire for wonder or terror. Another category of puzzling phenomena lies in the patterns on the landscape itself, geoglyphs, alignments, and ephemeral earthworks that are visible only from certain angles or times of day. Some are obvious. The straight roads of Chaco have to be walked to be felt, and their geometry insists on intentionality. Others are subtle, alignments of cairns, low stone rings, and faint berms whose function is maddeningly unclear. Were these regimens of marking territory, astronomical sight lines, or ritual processional ways? Some researchers have applied a landscape archaeology approach, reading features in relation to topography, hydrology, and sight lines, to suggest that these elements formed part of a complex system of wayfinding and memory. Still, others urge caution, reminding us that erosion and agricultural activity can create or mask patterns, producing pareidolia, a human tendency to find order where chance or later activity put it. The debate is lively, as it should be. Pattern recognition is a powerful scientific tool, but it is also an invitation to overinterpretation. As we sweep across these sites, the recurring motif is one of entanglement, material evidence that implies wide exchanges, social systems that alternately centralize and fragment, and an overlay of mythic imagination that both illuminates and complicates. We still do not have a single, coherent narrative for many of these places because, frankly, there may not be one. Human history is often a braided river of competing flows, environmental pressures, social reconfiguration, ideological transformations, and the sheer unpredictability of human choice. The archaeological record records the sediment, but it does not always tell us the shape of the current that carried it. Picture yourself, then, sitting on a windswept ridge at sunset, the valley below strewn with the markers of different centuries, the dark silhouette of a kiva rim, a white line of playa in the far distance, a solitary petroglyph catching the last light like a wink. Imagine the small domestic traces, a broken pot, a charcoal fleck, a child's tooth, next to grander stones and alignments meant to hold the public gaze. The juxtaposition hums with meaning. And then, to sharpen the poignancy, bring in the voices you will meet on the ground, indigenous elders who carry different priorities than the academic press, insisting that sites are not mere data but places of ongoing spiritual significance. Archaeologists who respect those voices and navigate the tricky terrain of collaboration and repatriation, and local people whose family histories are stitched, sometimes painfully, into the visible and invisible ruins. These engagements change the questions we ask. No longer can we treat ruins as inert, they are living nodes in a network of memory and meaning. When a community asks for a site to be left undisturbed because it is a place of prayer, that injunction reframes interpretation. The science must bow, not to superstition, but to the ethical imperative of respect. Through such collaborations, new interpretive possibilities emerge, oral histories that suggest migratory stories, clan memories that hint at ritual sequences, and place names that encode spatial knowledge lost to metropolitan narratives. We still do not, however, possess a final catalogue of meanings. As twilight deepens, think about why these unsolved puzzles grip us. Partly it's the thrill of the unknowable, wondering how others lived, loved, feared, and prayed. Partly it's the humility such mysteries enforce. Evidence can be abundant yet incomplete, and the best conclusions often arrive as probabilistic sentences rather than the bullet-point certainty the mind craves. And partly it is a recognition of continuity, that contemporary people, even those who never set a spade into the soil, carry forward the imagination of their ancestors when they stand on the same ground. Keep listening, then, for the hush and the drumbeat. The land speaks in measures both loud and small, and our work is to learn the language well enough to hold its contradictions. When you gather the pieces together, Chaco's straight lines and ritual chambers, the white hush of footprints in a lake bed, cliff rooms cut into the warming rock, stones scratched with centuries of language, the scattered artifacts that betray long routes of exchange, you begin to see a pattern that is not a single answer but an invitation to think differently about time. These places teach a discipline of attention. They ask you to slow down, to translate the small into the structural, to let the fragment itself insist on meaning. They show that human life in this landscape has been a conversation between bodies and elements, between intentionality and accident, and that the record we inherit is a palimpsest layered with decisions, disasters, innovations, and interpretations. Across these sites the same human energies return, making, moving, burying, marking, and in the interplay of those energies we find both the raw data that science measures and the mythic scaffolding that culture builds to hold events together. Think for a moment about scale and intimacy. Monumental architecture like that of Chaco speaks in the language of publics. It is a civic performance, a large-scale project that required coordination, labor, and perhaps coercion. A footprint, or a single bead, by contrast, speaks in the language of the particular. An individual walked here, a person carried that ornament, a child grew up eating a particular stew. The archaeological imagination must hold both scales at once. We cannot explain plazas without accounting for hearths. We cannot imagine processions without imagining the hands that tied sandals and spun cordage. This duality is not a liability of the discipline, but its richness. Our best stories of the past are those that find the tension between the collective and the private, and accept that a full understanding requires moving between them. Across the board, evidence has pushed scholars to refine their models. Tree rings and radiocarbon dates have tightened chronologies so that whole phases of construction can be tied to single decades. Geochemical sourcing, tying obsidian, turquoise, or shell to particular quarries and coasts, has turned trade from conjecture into mapped networks. Isotopic work on bones and teeth has filled in life histories, revealing mobility and diet in ways that pottery styles alone never could. Remote sensing and LIDAR have revealed faint earthworks and roadways hidden beneath vegetation or soil, and optically stimulated luminescence dating has added new temporal anchors in contexts where organic material is absent. These technical advances are not mere novelties. They are the tools that have converted speculation into disciplined inference. They also have the effect of multiplying questions. Each answer opens new corners of the map where we must go digging again, literally and intellectually. But alongside technical rigor, there is another kind of knowledge to honor, the living knowledge of people whose identities are interwoven with these places. Indigenous elders, language keepers, and community historians have insisted that archaeology cannot be extractive. It must be collaborative, ethical, and responsive. Where earlier generations of researchers treated sites as objects to be catalogued, contemporary practice increasingly treats them as relational places, sites of ongoing cultural significance. That shift changes what counts as evidence. Oral histories are not distractions from material data, they are testimonies that, when used responsibly, can guide interpretation, identify sites, and clarify practices that matter to descendants. When elders point to a place and recite a clan name, their words often encode spatial knowledge, place-based rituals, and genealogies that align with physical patterns in surprising ways. This is one of the most important lessons of recent decades. Archaeology is not just a conversation between scholars and artifacts, it is a conversation that must include the living descendants of those artifacts. There is a humane reason for this inclusion beyond morality. It yields better science. Ethnographic analogy, when used carefully, helps the interpretive process. The decisions to place a bone in a particular position, to orient a burial toward a certain cardinal point, or to lay down a bead under a threshold often make sense when we understand the symbolic grammars that inform those acts. Treaties between the past and present are fragile, and when communities ask that their ancestors' remains be treated with dignity, the researchers who listen often find that doing so yields insight rather than obstruction. That balance between respect and curiosity is where the best contemporary work happens. At the same time, mythic imagination will not, and should not, become the same as scientific certainty. The stories about giants, star people, or lost tribes are powerful cultural artifacts. They tell more about the fears and hopes of their tellers than they do about literal histories. Yet myths have a functional role. They are mnemonic devices and frameworks for meaning. They preserve a sense of place when material records have been broken or eroded. They offer metaphors that can guide research questions if treated with humility. When an elder tells of a long road walked by those who came from the south, that recollection might be an encoded memory of trade, a poetic rendering of a migration, or a corridor of myth that never corresponded to a physical road at all. All these possibilities matter. The scientist and the storyteller must be careful interlocutors. The unsolved elements, the we still don't knows, that echo through Chaco's plazas and under the gypsum, are not embarrassments. They are, in fact, the productive center of the entire endeavor. If archaeology and anthropology ever pretended to produce completeness, recent generations of research have shown how hubristic that pretension was. The gaps in our knowledge are the invitation to keep asking better questions and to bring newer methods and voices into the field. The footprint at White Sands nudges us to reconsider migration chronologies. The roadways around Chaco invite us to rethink political organization in the Southwest. The cliff dwellings push us to credit local decisions to shelter and community design. The petroglyphs and inscriptions urge us to read continuity and breakage together. These are not failures. They are the engines of scientific curiosity. Emotionally, there is something nourishing about that persistent uncertainty. It keeps the past alive as a series of possibilities rather than a dead archive. It invites listeners, like your YouTube audience, for whom this script is intended, to become active participants in wondering. When viewers imagine walking the Great North Road at dawn or tracing an ancient footprint with their fingers, mindful, of course, of preservation laws and cultural respect, they are practicing empathy at the scale of centuries. That exercise matters because it reheats a fundamental human skill, the ability to imagine another life in another time. In a world that too often narrows to immediacy, that skill is an act of cultural generosity. There are also practical implications buried in these mysteries. Cultural heritage in New Mexico is not merely an academic concern, it is land use policy, tourism strategy, and legal obligation. Sites must be protected from looters, climate change, and careless development. Rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns alter preservation conditions. Organic remains degrade faster, desert varnish fades, and ephemeral earthworks wash into invisibility. Interdisciplinary work that links conservation science with community stewardship is essential if these places are to remain readable to future generations. The artifacts are not just curiosities, they are the physical anchors for communities' identities, and their loss is the loss of an irreplaceable conversation with the past. Looking forward, what will the next decades likely bring? Expect more integration of methods and more respectful partnerships. Expect archaeogenetics, carefully and ethically applied, to contribute to understanding population movement and kinship, but also expect fierce debates over the ethics of sampling ancestral remains. Expect remote sensing to continue to reveal hidden landscapes, and expect material science to refine sourcing techniques so that trade networks can be mapped with increasing granularity. But also expect that not every question will yield neat closure. Some mysteries will resist because they are the product of lost languages, ephemeral practices, or political intentions that leave only the thinnest trace. That resistance is not a tragic failure, it is the very thing that keeps human history alive and interesting. Finally, what does all this mean for you and for us, the living who treasure, study, and steward these places? It means humility. It means a refusal to close a book too quickly. It means seeing archaeological sites not as museum pieces but as living intersections, of memory and material, of past lives and present responsibilities. It means listening to the people whose lives are entwined with these places and recognizing that they often carry more than data. They carry the moral right to define how their ancestors' traces are treated. It also means joy, the joy of discovery, the thrill of a footprint that bridges millennia, the wonder of realized connections between people separated by time but not imagination. When the dust settles on another field season and the data are tucked into journals and databases, the mysteries remain. They press on our curiosity like waves on a shore, sometimes receding to reveal new objects, and sometimes leaving behind a smooth, unmarked surface that belies the commotion it has seen. Our proper response is to keep looking, to keep listening, and to keep asking questions that are both rigorous and generous. The past is not hostile, it is often stubbornly partial, and that partiality is its dignity. So return in your mind now to the landscape that held our story, the mesas and canyons, the gypsum flats, the cliff mouths and carved stones. Here, in that imagined space, the echo of footfalls and drums, the scrape of a mason's chisel, the murmur of voices through a kiva's narrow door. Recognize that each mark, whether a monumental road visible for miles or a tiny bead under a floor, was placed by someone whose life mattered in ways we can only begin to reckon with. Our work is to honor those lives by seeking the best evidence, by embracing the voices of descendants, and by refusing the easy lure of sensational certainty. Keep digging in the generous sense of the phrase, not merely turning up objects but cultivating understanding, protecting place, and weaving together the scientific and the humanistic strands of inquiry. Some secrets will yield to patient scrutiny, others will remain, and they will be the sirens that call future generations back to the field. That call is not a summons to nostalgia, it is an invitation to stewardship and to wonder. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.